Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We will just give it a moment for everybody to file into the room. We have, at the last I checked, 150 people registered. I think on Thursday I checked, and so we are expecting a big audience, and we're really excited for this as we the league starts to dive into work on ranked choice voting. And yeah, please feel free to say hello in the chat. In the meantime, let us know where you are coming from and if you are a league member, which league you're with. All right, it looks like the number of participants has slowly started to slow down as they are ticking up. So I am going to go ahead and get started because we have so much to cover today. Again, welcome and thank you all for being here today. With us today, our guest speakers, Professor David Niven from the University of Cincinnati and Anna Keller, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Maine. I'll introduce our guests in a moment and then give them the floor. But first, a few housekeeping items. This is a webinar, and so your mics and video are automatically off. You may use the chat for comments, but please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen for questions so that I'm sure not to miss anything. We will have a dedicated Q&A after both of our guest speakers have presented, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. You may drop your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the webinar. We have enabled closed captioning, but you'll need to turn that option on for yourself at the bottom of your screen if you wish to have it displayed. Finally, I want to mention a few exciting events that we have coming up. I'll ask you to note these down because I'm unable to share my screen at this time. And we will certainly send out an email once we have the information confirmed. But as for now, like I said, these are just save the date events. On August 26th, we will have a Women's Equality Day event that will focus on framing reproductive rights as a nonpartisan issue. That's expected to be an evening event at 6 p.m. or 6:30 p.m. And on September 8th at 7 p.m., the league will be co-sponsoring an event with local leagues that will aim to further spread awareness and education about reproductive rights as a healthcare issue. And finally, on September 12th at noon, we'll have the next installment in our voter service training dedicated to serving housing insecure and transient voters. It will especially focus on voters who are homeless, but we'll also talk about some of the rules and logistics of voting for other transient populations, like those who are in the military, those who are incarcerated, students, and young adults. I hope you all will be able to attend some of those, but if you are not, those events we all expect to be recorded and they will be up on YouTube as usual. Please subscribe to our YouTube page so that you can get notifications when we have a new event. This event is also being recorded and will be up on our YouTube page by tomorrow. So today, excited to have our speakers with us, again, David Niven and Anna Keller. David Niven teaches American politics and conducts research on political campaigns, gerrymandering, political communication, and death penalty policy. David is the author of several books, including The Politics of Injustice, The Kennedys, The Freedom Rides, and the Electoral Consequences of a Moral Compromise, and he has published research in numerous journals. David was an expert witness in Ohio APRI versus Larry Householder, a case that challenged Ohio's congressional districts as an unconstitutional gerrymander. I'm sure all of our legal be familiar with that one. His political experience includes serving as the speechwriter for Ohio Governor Ted Strickland and for Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley's campaign for president. Afterwards, we will hear from Anna Keller, who is the executive director for the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, which partner together with Maine students vote under the banner of Democracy Maine. Anna grew up in Maine before earning her bachelor's in political science from Yale University and a master's in conflict studies from the London School of Economics. Their experience with democracy and anti-corruption campaigns in Eastern Europe and Central Asia makes them all of the more committed to preserving and strengthening civil society and grassroots democracy in Maine. Anna started working for Maine Citizens for Clean Elections in 2014 as an organizer on the Clean Elections Initiative. They ran for the state legislature as a clean elections candidate in 2016. In 2017, Anna was appointed as the first joint executive director for Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine. Thank you so much to the both of you for being with us today. And I will hand the floor over to Professor David Niven. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you for having me. And, it's a pleasure to be with this group again to talk about, a sort of revolutionary idea. I mean, it might not sound that revolutionary to Anna in Maine, where it's everyday practice, but it would have certainly a quite intriguing effect in Ohio were we to embrace ranked choice voting. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the basics of what it is, what it entails, what some of the headline research findings are from the academic side, and then just briefly get into a little bit of what this might mean potentially were it to exist in Ohio. Now let's see if I can surmount the share screen hurdle here. And let's see here, with any luck, and slideshow. All right, how we doing? Okay, all right. So fundamentally, what is ranked choice voting? As the name suggests, and as the official state of Maine instructions for voting a ranked choice ballot show us here, it's going past who do you want to elect for an office to, and who is your second choice, and who is your third choice, and should there be more than that candidates, who's your fourth choice? Fundamentally, of course, this is both a task and an opportunity for voters. It is asking voters to do something that we don't conventionally do, which is think past who is your absolute top choice and evaluate the field. We don't ask voters to do that. We don't ask them to distinguish. If we have three candidates, we don't ask them to distinguish between second and third. So it is a task, but of course it's an opportunity to be heard, and also an opportunity essentially to be freed from the concern that if there are three candidates and my favorite appears to all intents and purposes be the least popular, I'm torn, of course, between voting for that sincere preferred candidate and feeling like my vote might be wasted in that effort. So this frees that voter to vote for their sincerely preferred first candidate. And in a three-candidate race, let's say hypothetically, where the top two candidates get 40% of the vote, roughly 40% of the vote each, and the third place candidate gets 20%, that third place candidate, those will then ultimately, in scenario, get divvied up among the top two candidates. So I haven't wasted anything. I will ultimately, in that scenario, have the exact same effect, voting for sincerely preferred third place candidate as I would have for voting for one of the other two, because my third place candidates' votes will ultimately be divvied up. So as you see in this example, one of the aspects ranked choice voting that varies state by state is just how many people we're going to ask you to rank. Systems vary tremendously on this question. In some cases, it's just the top 3, even if there are far more than 3 candidates. Alaska's is the top 4. New York City, you may recall their mayor's race last year was a top 5 election. So the system varies tremendously in exactly how many ranked choices we're going to ask voters to make. Now, opponents of ranked choice voting will always point out this complicates things. And of course, it is a bit more complicated. Think of this in terms of going to a restaurant and you choose a meal. You just have to figure out your top meal. Now sit down to that same table and imagine, okay, choose a meal and be prepared because the restaurant's going to say your top choice isn't available. What's your second choice? And be prepared because they might say your top 2 choices aren't available. What's your third choice? That effort. The reality, vast majority of voters, they get their message across. This is from the state of Maine's official instructions, and I promise, and I'm not going to get into every single detail that you're dealing with in Maine, but just this is a great example of the kinds of things you have to think through with ranked choice voting. The example in case on the top left corner is, what if a person just wants to vote for one person? They just want to say who their first place vote is. And you're welcome to do that. Just because ranked choice voting exists doesn't mean you have to state a second choice or a third choice or a fourth choice. You can stop at 1, and that vote counts. It's fully valid. If your candidate remains viable, that vote holds through the entire process. The only downside of doing that is if your candidate comes in 5th or 10th or wherever in this race, your vote's not going to be divvied up to anybody else. You're not going to have a say in the process. As you can see in the second example, should you love your candidate so much that you vote for them in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th place, Maine still counts that. That's the vote again, holds as long as your candidate's in the process. That third box is what, in theory, you're intended to do, to write out all your preferences. But Maine has accounted for all kinds of possibilities. What if you state a first preference, third preference? They're prepared for you to skip a line here and there, and they essentially move up your third person in the process. So here's your bottom line. It's more complicated, but it's also more responsive, because if your first place candidate is out of the money, you're still in the game. So this is a flow chart of what happened in the Democratic primary for governor of Maine in 2018. And you can see in the on the far left, Janet Mills started, when you were looking at just first place votes, she started with 41,000 votes out of 132,000 cast. So roughly 30-some% of the vote. And so what does Maine do? Well, first it takes away, the candidates who were the farthest, of course, out of viability, and it divvies them up. And you can see those little lines that progress from round 1 to round 2. That's where those voters went. And so the biggest chunk went to Janet Mills. All right, so then you have Mills and 3 other candidates. So you take out the 4th place candidate. And again, you see the biggest chunk of those votes went to Janet Mills. All right, now you have Janet Mills and 2 other candidates. You still don't have a majority. She's, now in the upper 30s. You take out the 3rd place candidate and you see a very significant chunk of voters goes up to Mills. A very significant chunk of voters goes to the 2nd place candidate. And Mills, out of what had initially been 41,000 out of 132,000 votes cast, now has 63,000 and has a clear majority over the 2nd place finisher. Now, this is a significant aspect of this that folks need to understand. Mills has a majority of the viable votes. Ranked choice voting, we can kind of think of it superficially as the winner will get a majority. No, not really, Because as you can see here, one of the things that happens is ballots become unviable over each process because they either didn't continue past, their first place choice, didn't continue past their second place choice, and those candidates dropped out, of the process. So if your second choice was somebody who came in fourth, at some point they're removed from the process, and if you didn't state any more preferences, you're out of the process. So understand this distinction. It's clear among those who voted a full ballot, Mills won a majority. But that's different than saying of the voters, because as you can see, 63,000 is bigger than 53,000. She has a clear majority among those who cast ballot. But 60,000 is still the majority of the 132,000 who began.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It seems that it's not too bad, but it seems that there is some static coming from your mic. I'm not sure if it's a mic issue or a connection issue. But I just want to let you know, while you're sharing slides, it might be helpful to turn off your video.
Okay, sure.
Or to adjust your mic, if you
Sure.
want to call on those things.
Well, I apologize for any technical difficulties here. All right. Turned off the video. I hope that's a little bit better. Okay. Let me see if I can get back in here. Okay, so a majority winner, as long as you define majority as viable votes. It doesn't inherently produce a majority winner if you consider everybody who showed up to vote. Now, as Anna knows, this is really the sort of signature example of how ranked choice voting can affect the actual outcome. And so this was the race for Congress in Maine's 2nd district in 2018. And as you can see, in what we would consider to be the traditional vote, the Republican won with 46.4% of the vote. That's, when you take out the two independents and you divvy their votes up, more of them chose the Democrat as their second place vote rather than the Republican. And you suddenly transformed an outcome from a Republican winning this race with 46.4% of the vote to a Democrat winning 50.5% of the vote. And so, this is sort of the signature example where what is ranked choice voting for? It's for eliminating this kind of outcome where you're rewarded even though you couldn't have assembled a majority support, where you're rewarded because a third candidate or a fourth candidate or a fifth candidate, took enough votes away that you were able to sneak by even though you support. And about this, one, of course, it does show the power of empowering a majority. The second is, of course, it's able to vote in this case, for Bond, because there was no chance your vote would be lost in the process. You could vote Bond, and if Bond won, so much better. If Bond came in fourth, you still have a chance to be, and that's really where this matters so much. Okay, let's talk a little bottom line here. Where can you rank choice vote? Statewide, you can do it in Alaska, you can do it in Maine, and numerous localities across several states: California, Colorado, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, New York, Utah. Largely, we can say when you put ranked choice voting on the ballot in local elections, it's overwhelmingly popular. It's winning about 90% of the time when you ask local voters, should we do ranked choice voting? It has a mixed record as a statewide ballot question. It wins in some places. Obviously, and Anna will speak to this, part of what is unique in Alaska and Maine. They have much more of a tradition of electing either third-party candidates or having strong, strong independent candidates. So it matters more in places like that where the choices aren't just typically one-on-one elections. Okay, so what? What's the bottom line? What is valuable here about ranked choice voting? There is a kind of romantic assertion that it will make elections better. And there's actually a piece of research. There's only one, because there's not that much ranked choice voting research out there, because there's not that much ranked choice voting going on yet. But there isn't one study that actually looked at how local candidates in ranked choice voting settings, how they addressed each other in the media and in social media, and how they interacted and engaged. And it actually found that they were less likely to go negative against each other and more likely to engage on issue questions, because they suddenly had an incentive, not just to beat the field, which you would do in a traditional election, but to be acceptable choice, to be better else, yourself and distinguish yourself. So that's, I think that's probably the signature, kind of, hope for ranked choice voting, that it's not just, of third-party candidates or independent candidates, that it actually transform an election. Okay, here's some practical realities. Surveys of voters in ranked choice voting communities find older voters have more difficulty with this transition. And of course they do. If you voted, for 50 years, this person or the other person, of course it's going to seem quite revolutionary to you that it's this person or that person or the other person or the person, and now so older voters are more likely to, sort of drop out, be those undervotes, because they're not voting the whole ballot. Third point is important to understand the contrast with the main result that I showed you. In most elections, in most places, you could switch from ranked choice voting to traditional elections and you're going to get the same outcome. If there's only two candidates, for example, it's literally identical. But even when there's 3 or 4 or 5, if somebody gets a majority of the first place votes, you never get to the ranking system. The ranking system only matters if there's no majority winner. And here, as again, a matter in surveys, folks who support whatever the out party is, whatever the party that isn't winning elections in a state, are more likely to support ranked choice voting. So, in terms of the practical realities of selling this. Now, let me just say quickly, what would it do in Ohio? Couple of big things. One, of course, is we do have some monster primaries. We just saw one on the Republican side for Senate, where J.D. Vance becomes the Republican with about 1/3 of the vote. So what you get with ranked choice voting is the potential. We don't know this, but if J.D. Vance was widely unacceptable to those other 70% of the voters, in ranked choice voting, they might have coalesced around another alternative. Whereas in traditional system, all it takes, in a big field, 30 can be enough to win. Second, very important thing in Ohio, even though we don't have the tradition like Maine or Alaska of electing third party or independent candidates, think about this. Our current state auditor, Keith Faber, was elected with 49.7% of the vote. Would he be in office with ranked choice voting? Only if he could have assembled a majority from among those other voters. Think about this one for a moment. Mike DeWine was elected Attorney General in 2010 in Ohio with 47.5% of the vote. 47.5%. There's a very real chance he could not have assembled a majority on his own, and wouldn't have been elected in office, would not have started his political comeback. So there is, there's some, power in giving voters a chance to say whether these majorities exist. And just one sort of final note for what the future of this might hold in Ohio, there are cities like Cincinnati that use a runoff election. There are cities like Columbus that use kind of a preliminary candidate elimination round. You could get rid of those things with ranked choice voting and still give people a full opportunity to vet candidates and to, for candidates then to be elected on a majority basis. And one word of warning, Florida legislature preemptively prohibited ranked choice voting in qualities. So in Florida, we're, Boca Raton want to experiment with ranked choice voting. It's banned in the state of Florida. So one of the things that could in Ohio is if this move get underway, the legislature stop cities from, and you might have to, start at the top and do it statewide or not at all. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about this issue with you all. And I'm sorry if the audio quality was less. I hope that this start of a very conversation about how ranked choice voting could be a potentially interesting election innovation.
Thank you so much, David. There were some sound issues, but I was able to get the kind of overall gist of what you were saying. So we appreciate you, and we definitely have a lot to come back to in the Q&A session. I'm not sure if you're able to change your location if you're on a laptop in that
Right.
time period. That may also help, but I appreciate your patience with us. I will now hand over the mic to Anna Keller. Anna, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Let me get my screen share up here. But first, can you all hear me okay? Sound all right to you?
I can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay. So I really appreciate Professor Niven's awesome introduction. That we've done a lot of explanations of ranked choice voting in Maine over the last decade, and I thought that was a really great, clear and comprehensive introduction. But let me just get this up here. Great. So what I want to add to this discussion is a little bit about the history of how Maine got ranked choice voting and what the journey has been like really through that process, and some of the work that we see as still to be done in terms of fully transitioning to ranked choice voting in Maine, and how that has been influential in a lot of ways on the work that we do as a league in every part of our elections work. And so I know not everyone here is necessarily a league member, but as many of you are, coming to this issue with that hat, I also want to make sure to be bringing that, that league perspective, because truly our involvement with ranked choice voting has been transformational to the Maine League. As you heard, I'm the executive director for the league in Maine, and have been involved with ranked choice going back even before I was in that role. I first was helping a candidate run for the state legislature who was interested in it all the way back to 2012. And so it's something that I've been passionate about for a long time, and continue to be a big advocate for, at the same time as I also spend a lot of time talking to voters who may not like it, but still just need to know how to use it. And that's a role that we play as an organization as well. So you heard what some of the important advantages of ranked choice voting are. In Maine, we really have focused on this issue of majority support because Maine has a history of electing statewide candidates with only a minority of the vote. And that problem, the spoiler problem, and the idea that a candidate could be elected who the majority of voters don't like, were the problem that ranked choice voting was solving in Maine. We've seen some of the advantages of ranked choice voting in all of these other ways, including some of the reduction of negative campaigning and allowing for more candidates to be able to run in a broader range of candidates. And I can talk a little bit about some of those examples. It also isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't ensure all of these things all of the time. And there are certainly lots of other reforms that we need in our politics to get to a fully, democratically representative system. So Maine, just to review quickly, our current status, we use ranked choice voting in the general elections and the primaries for president, for Senate, and for House, so all of those federal races. We also use it in the primary elections for governor and the state legislature. And in two towns, Portland and its neighboring city of Westbrook, we use ranked choice voting for local elections as well. And those were, independently chosen, those cities to use ranked choice voting. I live in Portland, that's where I'm coming from now. And so I'll also speak just a little bit about that municipal experience, because the interplay between the municipal and the state ranked choice voting campaigns and implementation has been very relevant to our experience. And that has also been the case in many of the other states that we talk to. We have a lot of resources about ranked choice voting on our Maine league website, and are always happy to go into any of those details. But the history of ranked choice voting in Maine goes all the way back to 2001, way before this was part of the national dialogue. And that's because Maine has this history of electing independents. We had a 2-term independent governor. We've had also strong third parties. We have one of the only states that's ever had a member of the Green Party elected to our state legislature. We've had a strong Libertarian Party at times. And so in Maine, it's not unusual to have 3 or more candidates, even in a general election. And with that, there's also a long history of interest in election reform in Maine. And so while ranked choice voting isn't the only system that was ever considered, we have this history going all the way back to 2001. The league got involved in 2008, did a study on ranked choice voting, and endorsed it. We then used that study position to support the efforts that were happening in Portland at the time to have ranked choice voting be the method for Portland's first elected mayor. They were having a charter commission, changing some of the forms of government, and ranked choice voting was selected as the means for electing the mayor, this new position. And so it was an opportunity to try something different in an election where there was no incumbent. Nobody had ever run for the mayor in the city before. And so nobody was potentially losing out by trying a new method. And so there was this space to innovate. In that first election, there were 15 candidates. It took all the way through elimination down to get to somebody who had a majority. They had to go through all of those rounds. But in the end, the candidate that won was the candidate who had the most first choice votes and would have won under a non-ranked choice system. So it was an interesting example of how even in a really crowded race like that, it didn't change the outcome, but it did create a real sense of a mandate for that first elected mayor. Since that experience at the municipal level, the league got more involved with working at the state level with legislators who were interested, other national advocates, and we started drafting our own law and introducing that in 2013. That effort, which became a citizen initiative and was eventually passed by the voters in 2016, was very much influenced in the political context by the fact that Maine had elected Paul LePage as our governor in 2010, after an election where we had a very prominent independent running as well as a Democrat. LePage is a Republican, sort of a many things in common with a Trump-style Republican before Trump, very divisive. So there were a lot of voters who thought, well, I could vote for the independent, I could vote for the Democrat, but I just don't want LePage to be elected. However, the vote was split between the independent and the Democrat, and LePage was elected with 39% of the vote. Coming out of that experience, there was a large number of voters, and 61% of voters who felt like the system hadn't worked well for them. And so in that context, it started out are going to support ranked choice voting. And so while that definitely raised the importance of the issue and made people passionate, it also introduced a partisan element into the conversation around this time. And so the League was involved all the way through a citizen initiative campaign, collecting the signatures to get that on the ballot, and then eventually supporting a campaign to pass ranked choice voting in 2016. After that effort, where we were involved in doing lots of educational work as well as some active campaigning, there was a real question about how Maine was going to implement this law. And there were still some remaining legal questions that hadn't ever fully got handled before we headed to the ballot. And so in 2017, the Maine State Supreme Court gave an advisory opinion that concluded that we couldn't use ranked choice voting in the general elections for governor and the state legislature. That's because the Maine state constitution had a clause saying that candidates needed to be elected with a plurality. After that court decision, the Maine legislature repealed the entire RCV law, not just for those races where it had been said it was unconstitutional. And so with that, we actually went back to the ballot. Maine has a process for a people's veto, where you can collect signatures in order to put something on the ballot. If you get the signatures, it freezes the implementation of the law, as well as giving people another chance to vote on it. And so it meant that we had this unusual circumstance where in June 2018, we had the first use of ranked choice voting statewide in that primary election. And at the same time, we had people voting on whether or not to keep using it. And so with that election, as you heard and saw some of the examples of how it turned out, we had crowded primaries for governor in both major parties. We had an opportunity for a lot of voters to use ranked choice voting for the first time. And overall, the response was positive. And we know the response was positive because as people used it for the first time, they also voted to keep it. And then in November, we had the first statewide usage for our federal elections. And so you heard about the congressional race that changed, where it changed the outcome. The implementation of this and voter experience during the actual process of voting and counting the votes was very positive. We heard really from people all over the state, all different backgrounds, that they understood it, that they were able to use it. We were worried that the delay that ranked choice voting can cause in the results being known might cause trouble, but candidates and the media were really willing to be patient and explain to voters what was going on with that. So we were very impressed with the work that was done by our elections administrators and the media, and we spent a lot of time working behind the scenes to make sure all of those folks knew what they were doing and how to talk effectively to the public about ranked choice voting. What we couldn't control, though, is that there's a winner and a loser in an election. And so Bruce Poliquin, who had lost his congressional seat, blamed ranked choice voting for it. And with that, the combination of this sort of already the suspicion that it was about, was it being against LePage, and then this fact that Poliquin had lost a race, most Republicans at that point decided ranked choice voting isn't for us. Not because of anything philosophical. They have some explanations for why they don't like it, but really what it comes down to is that in those initial races, there was this sense that, oh, well, we're going to lose when we use ranked choice voting. Over time, I suspect that they're going to start to come around because political circumstances will change. And if you look at where ranked choice voting is used around the world, there is a wide variety of political contexts, and it does not tend to support more progressive or more conservative or candidates from any particular political leaning. When you put that over time, it just depends on what the political context of your electorate is. I did want to mention one thing that we found really exciting about the first use of ranked choice voting, is that in that Democratic gubernatorial primary in 2018, we saw cross endorsements. And this is something that you only ever see under ranked choice voting, where two of the candidates said, we have a lot in common. We are both we have more in common than we do with the other candidates in the race. You should vote for me first and her second, or me first and him second. And we saw that not every voter chose to do that who voted for one of them first, but a lot of them did. And it played a role in Betsy Sweet, who was a fairly unknown candidate coming in, ending up making it all the way until the top 3 of the candidates, because she got a lot of second choice votes from Mark Eves. But we were glad to see that it did the candidates were starting to think creatively about how ranked choice voting could impact their campaigns and to increase some of the opportunities for civility and coalition building. We also started to see advocacy groups choosing to rank their endorsements. And all of these things mean that when you're coming out of an election, particularly coming out of a primary election, a lot of that work that maybe you have to spend the first month after an election doing of sort of healing divisions on your own side, a lot of that work has already been done during the campaign. And we saw that again, where the primary in particular was less divisive than it might have been without ranked choice voting. We have since passed and implemented ranked choice voting for the presidential election. In 2020, Portland expanded ranked choice voting to all municipal elections, not just the mayor. That's a campaign that I was closely involved with, and we were so excited to see that ranked choice voting passed with 83% of the vote when we put it on the ballot for Portland for the expansion. That really says to us, Portland voters who have used this system longer than anyone like it. It was such common sense. Well, of course we should use it for our other races. And since then, we've also seen, like I said, Westbrook passed it in 2021. And we're now looking at other communities around the state that could pass it municipally. Part of the reason that we're thinking so much locally at this point is because we're thinking about how to start building support on the right and how to get voters and elected officials from a wider political background to accept, if not be enthusiastic about ranked choice voting. Partly this is because in order for us to actually get it for governor and for the state legislature in the general election, we'd need a constitutional amendment. That needs to get 2/3 of the vote in both chambers of the legislature. We're not going to get there unless we have cross-partisan support. And so that is our long-term goal at this point. But in the meantime, what we can do to help get ourselves there, I'll come back to this, but what we can do to help get ourselves there is by expanding the municipal usage of RCV and having more people experience a variety of winners out under the system. The more places that use it, the more conservative winners there will be. And we think that over time, that process is going to start to erode this sense of it being against Republicans and for Democrats, to the point that eventually we will see it just widely accepted statewide, and we'll be able to get that constitutional amendment passed without so much controversy. A few other pieces of work that we are trying to get to at this point, trying to go backwards a slide here, which I am terrible at figuring out, but well, I will just say that the other piece that we're looking at right now that may be relevant to some elections, and particularly municipal city level elections in Ohio, is that we're looking at how does ranked choice voting work in multi-winner elections. That's when you might have, you're going to elect 2 people to your city council at the same time. And so you have your slate of candidates and you vote for 2 of them. There's some different rules about how that works. It can also, ranked choice voting applied to that creates proportional representation, which can be a really exciting way of ensuring that more people's voices are heard in legislative bodies, city councils, all of that. We don't have a position on that proportional ranked choice voting in Maine, and so we're looking into that. It's going to be relevant to our expansion at the local level, but it's also something that we've seen get taken up in places like Portland, Oregon. And so we're going to be looking at that as a policy question moving forward, as well as supporting activists at the local level to be advancing their own local initiatives to institute ranked choice voting. And then finally, the other piece that we're doing is trying to be supportive of folks who are campaigning for RCV in places around the country, and in particular to support leagues who are doing voter education about ranked choice voting. And the reason why that, beyond just wanting to be, helpful, good citizens about it, is that we're doing that is because, like I said, this opportunity, educating voters about a new voting system, is something that the league is incredibly well positioned to do because they're trusted messengers and have expertise that ranges across the complexities of election systems all the way to how to do good public education. And so the league can be an important player in those efforts. And through that, we've been able to build lots of new partnerships. We were able to raise the money that allowed us to expand our staff to run the statewide education campaign. And it's really given us this experience of what it's like to take an issue all the way from the thing that we first propose and have an idea for and think, okay, we're going to endorse this policy, all the way through a complicated campaign, a complicated implementation process, and really the long-term viability of it. And so through our ranked choice voting, we've really expanded our expertise and our power as a league. And that's something that I see opportunities for folks to do around the country. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. We have the academic aspect, we have the practical aspect, and we have a ton of questions to dig into. We'll try to get to as many as we can while our guests will stick around for us. Probably the most common question I've seen from folks is that clearly the both of you seem to prefer ranked choice voting or like ranked choice voting, but I think I heard hints of it, but if you can clearly tell us, what do you see as the challenges or disadvantages with ranked choice voting? And I'll start with you, Professor Niven.
Sure. I mean, the challenge that a certain percentage of people are going to have difficulty with this, and inherently, as you just saw in Anna's presentation, there's there's a movement toward a majority winner, but that it in some cases, as you heard, that takes an awful lot of rounds of eliminating candidates. So it does take a certain amount of voter endurance. That's not a reason to give up on the idea, but it's a challenge that has to be acknowledged. We're gonna run out of patience for it. Some people, as I said, the limited academic research shows older voters are going to be a little bit more resistant to getting on board with a new system that requires them to sort of approach this in a new way. Politically, the opposition, as you heard, is whoever's doing well now, inherently has a bias toward not changing things So you have, I think, and it's similar to our discussions about, gerrymandering reforms. You have a basic core message of fairness that people respond to. And I think it's why, you've seen great majorities in Maine and elsewhere embrace this in the right setting, where you say, all right, well, we want to have elections that elect people who are really supported and have majority support. You have sort of an inherent citizen interest in that, but it of course is subject to the political pushback that you're complicating things, that you're in some way making voting harder, and that's that excludes some people.
Thank you. Anna, other than the learning curve that is clearly there, can you summarize what you have seen in your experience to be the arguments against ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that it's confusing does stop people. And often the conversations we have are that we have to accept that lots of people are very confused about their current voting system. If ranked choice voting gives us an excuse and some resources to go do lots of voter education and reach people who may be low information voters, it actually might, get us up to a higher level of voter information than they had previously. That's certainly been our experience with some of the communities that we've worked with. But the opposition that we tend to hear the most from Republicans is this idea that somehow ranked choice voting is not one person, one vote. And because you're voting for more than one candidate, you're still, as one person is not getting more vote than anybody else is under this circumstance, but that's something that gets brought up. And I think because once you start to dig into it, you start talking about more complex political science terms, then people start to go, wait, this is too confusing, and tune out from there. And so I just would say that what our experience has been is that once people use it, they tend to realize that the actual system is not that complicated. If you're a political strategist trying to think about how to campaign effectively under it, you can make it fairly complicated if you want to. But for the actual voter, the experience tends to be, no more simple than ranking things in any other part of your life.
Thank you. Professor Niven, next I'd like to dive into kind of some specifics around Ohio. Can municipalities in Ohio use ranked choice voting if they vote for it in their location without interference from the state legislature? Is there anything currently in our code or constitution that would prevent that?
The short answer is right now, a municipality could adopt this. We have a wide array of practices at the municipal level. Cincinnati has a vastly different, city election scheme than Columbus has, than Cleveland has, and on down to the localities. So, a locality could change their system, with respect to their own elections. Obviously, it has no implications for anything higher, but you could elect mayors this way. You could elect city council members this way. And as I said, we have variations, in Cincinnati, they use a runoff, and one of the big effects of ranked choice voting, and we would see this, a lot of southern states, famously, of course, Georgia, if you don't win a majority on election day, they have a runoff after the election. Ranked choice voting is a consolidation, and in that sense, it's quite empowering to voters, because in Cincinnati right now, to be fully heard in a race for mayor, you have to vote twice when there's a runoff. Otherwise, you're out. Whereas with ranked choice voting, you have a chance to be heard with one vote. So it's possible, and it would, be quite consequential in places, where we see, rules, whether it's in Cincinnati or the sort of preliminary elimination round that we have in Columbus.
Okay, and so if we say that it is instituted statewide or locally, are BOEs equipped to be able to handle ranked choice voting, whether it be administratively, cost-wise, voting machines? Is it something that we can just do, or are there any other hurdles to it?
Let me let Anna jump in on what Maine faced on that.
Yeah, and I don't know about what systems Ohio is using right now. I saw some questions that were, relevant to particular types of machines. What we found with Maine was that the machines that we were using, so we have all paper ballots that go into scanners and tabulators, except for the few towns that are small that still do hand count. And how it worked for us is that all of those ballots and tabulator records get brought together to the Secretary of State's office in Augusta, and that's where they do the final tabulation once they've made sure that they have everything that they're supposed to have there. It's why there's a delay, but it also allows for that extra process of checking and making sure that the results are going to be accurate. They do a lovely job of really transparently showing their whole process, and live streaming and explaining every step of what they're doing with the count. And we were actually able to use the same machines, the same software from a company that we were already using. They had a software update that covered ranked choice voting. And so we were able to do that. And Maine's 504 town clerks, because our elections are administered at the municipal level, and no matter how tiny your town, carried it out. They were trained and they did what they needed to do, and they explained to voters how to mark the ballot. And so we were very nervous because at the time, the Secretary of State wasn't talking to the advocates very much. And so we were kind of hoping. He hadn't been a huge fan beforehand. We were kind of just hoping things were going to go well behind the scenes, but they really did do a fantastic job. And one thing that we have as an advantage in the national movement around ranked choice voting is that there's a huge amount of resources available from former elections officials and software experts and people who, there's an organization called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center that really just focuses on these implementation questions. And so, as long as an election official is willing to say, what's the best practice? How do I get this going? There are so many people who are ready to step in and help.
Yeah, and I would just add, the short answer is, in terms of voting machines, it's really not that much complicated than thinking, let's 4 candidates, thinking of it as a series of multiple questions. So vote first, who's your first choice? Vote second, who's your second choice? You don't have to make it a massive, just thinking that as 4 elections instead of 1. I think my internet says it's unstable, so I apologize if I'm fading out here. But there is some research that elections officials are grumpy when this comes up, and that all things equal, they'd prefer not to have to deal with it. But I think just as you heard from Anna, the bottom line is, and we saw this in New York City, it may have taken them a while, but it was perfectly doable.
Elections officials hate change, period, has my general experience, but that once they have to do something, they're pretty good at figuring it out. And so sometimes, even though we love our elections officials and spend a lot of time trying to support them and boost them up and get them the resources they need, sometimes, they're not there to think, how could the system be made better? Most of the time, very few of them, view that as part of their job. And so that's why it takes outside activists and citizens to tell them when those kinds of things need to be changed.
Thank you. And Anna, I'm not sure if you spoke to this, but has it shown the use of ranked choice voting, has it shown to save costs, save money in election spending from the state? And does it also result in less spending in election campaigns?
So what we've seen is, unfortunately, no, it doesn't result in less spending that we've seen. I think you could imagine a campaign where, because there was less negative campaigning, therefore there was less money that was being spent. While we've seen examples of positive campaigning, it's it hasn't been to the degree that it's changed the overall dynamic of the race. And I would say the other factors that are driving campaign spending still are dominant. And Maine has just came off of a very, very intensely high spending Senate race in 2020. But it wasn't because of ranked choice voting. It's because of the other factors that are creating the problems around money in politics. So I wish I could say that it fixes it. I think we also need things like public funding and other forms of campaign finance legislation that, together can make a big difference to our campaigns, but it's not a silver bullet in that way that it can fix everything. But we have seen, so in terms of costs to the state, because Maine doesn't have a two-stage election, we didn't see the kinds of cost savings that a state like Georgia would have, or that Cincinnati would have, of not having to have a second election. There are some implementation costs, but they've been pretty minor. It's been mostly transporting ballots to the central location and making sure they had, safe transportation to the central location, and some of the work around voter education, and a little bit around software. But it's not, it hasn't been expensive, but it hasn't necessarily saved us money either. I think where you would see those savings, or if it meant that you got to have, one fewer election.
Great, thank you. And we are at 1 o'clock, but if you'll both be patient with me, there's one more thing that several questions revolve around, and that's this idea of using ranked choice voting in primaries versus the general election. Does it remove the need for partisan primaries? And if you could kind of generally speak to what is the difference between using ranked choice voting in a primary election versus in a general election, and why one or the other?
Sure. So we have ranked choice voting now in all of our primaries. We also just passed a law for semi-open primaries in Maine. Our primaries previously have been closed. You have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary and registered Republican to vote in the Republican primary. We've just changed it so that by 2024, you can be an independent and choose one or the other. We have seen that on the Democratic side, there's been a real embrace of ranked choice voting, and that those candidates have tended to really actively talk about ranking your ballot. Even if I'm not your first choice, put me as your second choice, and embrace it. And like I said, I think we've seen some of the impacts and benefits of that in having less divisive primaries and some party cohesion coming out of it. I think, I've always said sometimes that like parties as parties sometimes view ranked choice voting as, oh, that's good for independents, it's not good for parties. But actually what we've seen is that when parties embrace it, it can actually be really good for their own internal processes of organizing and cohesion. In the general election, you have a different dynamic because you're less likely to have 5 or 6 candidates unless you've got independents or third parties. And so it's more likely that you might have an election with just one small third party candidate who might just be a spoiler. It's a different dynamic than when you're seeing a lot of that jockeying. And there, it's been interesting to see the candidates that have been willing to go court the voters of those, maybe small fringe candidates have benefited. It's been, and that was partly how our current congressman ended up winning that race and beating the incumbent, was because he went to the 2 independents and said, we're not going to agree on everything, but I'm a better second choice than the other guy is for you. And so he got more of those second choice votes, and that was the margin of victory. Whereas on the Republican side, they said, we don't like ranked choice voting, just vote for us as your first choice candidate. And that's the only campaign that they ran. And so it made a difference.
So Anna, since you guys are now well into the ranked choice voting journey, do you foresee a situation in which ranked choice voting in the general election could possibly remove the need for a primary election?
It could. I mean, this is where we're going to be watching Alaska's system very closely, where they are doing this process of having a top 4 election and then ranked choice among those top 4. It's going to be, when the league did our study, we actually looked at sort of that jungle primary, open primary way of doing ranked choice. That's sort of just one ranked choice instead of the primary, and saw some downsides to it in terms of just clarity for voters. But I'm very curious to see how this works in Alaska, and it's something that we're considering. We might even consider changing our position if we can see that the benefits of it in terms of good choice, variety of choices, and voter participation are there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any closing remarks from you, Professor Niven?
Well, just to amplify what you just, excuse me, heard from Anna, you can do ranked choice voting inside exactly the process that we use right now, which is, what Maine's doing. You have a primary and it produces one Democrat, one Republican. You can also do some science. You can use a jungle primary system where all the candidates are on one ballot to begin with. Those are variations, but the core question of ranked choice voting is just giving people say, and who's your second choice and who's your third choice, so that in effect, whoever they support first, they're free to do it and they're free to have the full effect of their vote count.
Thank you so much to the both of you. I just have some messages also for our audience revolving around some of the questions. As we sent out in marketing material around this event, the League of Women Voters of Ohio does not currently have a position on ranked choice voting. There are almost 20 questions that are still unanswered. This is a new subject for all of us in Ohio. We are exploring and learning about in a number of ways. Many people are getting involved in our study, and that is one way. And we will continue to have education around this issue as the study is ongoing. And so I just want to acknowledge that I apologize greatly to all the people who did not have their questions answered, but there's obviously a lot of interest around this, and we will continue to provide education around this issue. As we get closer to kind of seeing what happens in Ohio and whether the league produces a position on ranked choice voting. Thank you so much to the both of you, Professor David Niven and Anna Keller from the League of Women Voters of Maine. This has been really enlightening for us, and I'm sure we will probably speak to you about this issue again. Thanks again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So much. I tried to stick my email in the chat, but I think it only went to the panelists. But if anybody would like to discuss more, have questions about Maine, I'm always happy to. And it's just anna@lwvme.org.
Thank you so much to the both of you. And I will send a follow-up email with the recording to this presentation, as well as some additional resources and contact information. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.